Good evening from the Gail Lemron Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Welcome to the President Speaker Series. On behalf of President John P. Johnson, I'm Mark Bernier, moderator for tonight's event. What would happen if all the lights went out? There are many people in our assembled audience tonight that went through that years ago, several power failures in the country, but none of them may have been created by the event we're talking about tonight. What is an EMP, and what would happen if it hit in this country? How would we live our lives? What is the risk of an EMP, and what is the country doing, its government, to ensure that we don't have this happen? Our guest talks about that tonight. We're joined by a man who many of you know from national television and his service to this nation over a course of many years, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. He is the president of the Center for Security Policy. He also writes for the Washington Times, Big Piece, and Town Hall, and he is a radio host on Secure Freedom Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce to you, to the Embry-Riddle audience here and to our radio audience on WNDB, the Honorable Frank Gaffney.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Am I good to go? We're going to talk for you.
A little bit. Up front, wanted to establish, many of you have seen Frank on television, and I have to say, if it wasn't for Judge Jeanine Pirro, I don't think that many Americans over weekends would even know that this EMP threat exists. It's been written about for a number of years. Frank is one of the leading experts on the threat of nuclear weapons and EMPs, which is why we asked him to come here tonight. So you'll have a chance to ask your questions. Frank's going to show a little bit about it. How did you get into the whole idea of defense of this nation and your service? Because you work with people, from what I read, on both sides of the aisle, including Scoop Jackson.
That's right. Lucky, I think, is how it best is explained. I had a chance to work for Scoop in his presidential campaign. Some of you may remember it, back in 1975 and 76. It did not go the distance, needless to say, but it got me started with him working in his foreign policy and defense staff. I worked on Armed Services Committee related issues with him for a time, and then when the Senate switched majorities in 1980 with the Reagan landslide, went to work for John Tower in the Senate Armed Services Committee professional staff, and then on to the Pentagon with one of my former colleagues in Scoop's office. So it just all sort of was serendipitous, a lot of the right place at the right time, and a lot of luck.
Okay, let's get right to the heart of it, because we know we're going to have a lot of people here tonight. What would happen if an EMP happened? First, it's electromagnetic pulse, and I know you have some visual support for our audience tonight. How did this come about? Who invented the EMP?
Well, I don't know that anybody invented it so much as they discovered it. Back in the Cold War, at a time when the Soviet Union and the United States were first learning about nuclear weapons and their effects, the Soviets detonated a very large, I think it was a 25 megaton nuclear weapon in space. And it turned out the lights in Kazakhstan. And we subsequently had a similar kind of experience with a nuclear weapon that we tested out in the Pacific outside the atmosphere, and it turned off some of the lights in Honolulu. So we began very much in the sort of classified national security domain, discovering that something very peculiar would happen when gamma rays emitted by a nuclear weapon began interacting with the upper atmosphere and created immense amounts of electromagnetic energy that would, from a line of sight, basically, depending on the height of that burst, cover a lot of real estate on the ground with what would be very damaging, if not absolutely devastating, to electric and electronic devices that weren't shielded against it.
How many people have seen the movie, I believe it's called The Day After, about a nuclear attack? You remember what the scene was like when Jason Robards is in a car and it suddenly stops and he looks and his watch stops? That's just a sample of what this is. Frank has brought some visual support tonight. Show us, to explain what this is and what happens.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Mark for allowing me to deviate from the normal just give and take, which I'm anxious to do as well. But I did want to show you some visuals because I think some of this gets a little hard to get your head around. So we'll just go through this very quickly. We're going to go through it at all. Am I going the wrong way? There we go. This fellow is no longer, of course, the president of Iran. He wasn't really running things when he was, but this was a statement that sort of stuck with me. A world without America is not only desirable, it's achievable. And I believe these guys have been pursuing it ever since. When you think about it, does that mean, whoa, sorry, operator errors here. More of the sort of terrorism that they've engaged in to date. We've seen it since 1979. Maybe the sort of cyber warfare that they've engaged in of late, particularly. Or perhaps, as the president said recently, a nuclear attack on one of our cities. All of those would be very bad things, needless to say. As the bumper sticker used to go, it would ruin your whole day to be under a nuclear attack. But the question is that really going to conduce to a world without America? And I don't think so, but there is another possibility that is both near-term practicable, perhaps something that could be done without fingerprints and done very cost-effectively. How? By detonating, as we just were discussing, a nuclear weapon in space over, say, a place like Cleveland. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself again. You would see this kind of electromagnetic pulse laydown over much of the United States. And I'm going to show you what's under that in a moment. How could an Iranian nuclear weapon, for purpose of discussion, let's say, be detonated over the United States? They're said not to have long-range missiles capable of reaching us from their shores. Well, this is one way. It's called a scud in a tub scenario. This is an artist's depiction of what a launcher concealed in a container might look like. Something that could be brought close to our shores. They have lots of these, and in fact have tested ballistic missiles off of vessels, and indeed have tested them in a manner that looks as though it's designed to simulate detonating something at the apogee of the missile. By the way, this is not an entirely hypothetical proposition, because their close allies, the North Koreans, had this vessel intercepted in the Panama Canal last July, a year ago, and under 10,000 tons of sugar were two of these things. Relatively primitive not ballistic missiles, air defense missiles. They'd get up to about 75 miles, which would give you a pretty good-sized footprint. And they were nuclear capable. They didn't have nuclear weapons on them, but could, conceivably, which is, again, of concern if this sort of scenario is what one or the other of these powers might have in mind. Is there reason to believe that the North Koreans are thinking about nuclear attacks against the United States? Well, indeed there is. This was a photograph taken in April of last year with, I call him Dear Leader 3.0, Kim Jong-un, meeting with the general staff of his military against the backdrop of a map that said in its title, "The Strategic Forces Plan to Strike the U.S. Mainland." Well, that's kind of a clue. And of course, these are guys who actually have nuclear weapons. The Iranians may or may not. They have, in fact, threatened us repeatedly, and they've been working closely with Iran. This just gives you an example of what a blackout looks like in a country like ours. This one was not generated by an EMP, needless to say. It actually was a tree branch that touched a power line that sagged in a very hot day in northern Ohio back in 2003. This is what a relatively orderly departure from New York City looked like on a not so bad day, thank God. That went on for about 2 days before they got the power back on. Let me just go back to this footprint. What's underneath that? This is important, sorry. This is important to get a sense of the concentration of the generating capacity of the United States pretty much under where such an attack would hit. This is what is a similar kind of concentration of high voltage transformers, which are the things that push the power through the lines, raising it and lowering it to get to destinations like your home and businesses. What do those things look like, those high voltage transformers? I'm not talking about the ones that you see on telephone poles or on a lot of substations in your neighborhood, perhaps. These are the big ones. These are extremely high voltage, in some cases high voltage. And as you see here, you get a sense not only of the size, but of what a trick it is to get it from point A to point B. And that's a problem because we have to get most of them from someplace else. It takes, by the way, a long time to get them from someplace else. The average length of time to manufacture one, by the way, to custom specifications, is about a year, in some cases a year and a half. And that's if you're at the front of the line. So that's a problem, but I do want to just quickly mention, though our focus tonight is on EMP, that there are other ways of attacking something that has the inherent vulnerabilities of our electric grid. I'll just go through a couple of these very quickly. If you know what you're doing, and I imagine there are people in this university that do, at Radio Shack, you can put together what is called a radio frequency weapon, something that would do in a sort of localized way retail, the kind of power loads that an EMP would create and take down a substation. For example, you do enough of that and it's a serious problem. There's cyber attacks, and I won't go through all of this except to say that this is something that we're seeing vectored to the electric utilities that operate our grid. With, as was pointed out by the Bipartisan Policy Center back in February, with increasing frequency and sophistication. One particular concern is this one. You may have heard of Stuxnet. This was a malware that, turns out, we and the Israelis generated to attack the centrifuges in Iran, to try to slow down their nuclear weapons program. Somebody has reverse engineered it or modified it and put it into 1,000 utility control systems in this country and in Europe, which is kind of a problem. And then there's this. I don't know how many of you may have heard of this back in April of last year. In the dark of night on the 16th of the month, actually the same time that Kim Jong-un was having his photograph taken, talking about an attack on the United States, some unknown number of people broke into 2 manhole-covered vaults in proximity to this station outside of San Jose, California. They went in the vaults, they cut telecommunications lines, including a 9/11 system for the facility. They then moved to pre-sighted firing positions out here and pumped 120 rounds into the cooling radiators of the 17 of the 21 of those giant high voltage transformers on this substation. 110 of them hit their mark, again in the dark of night. You started seeing the cooling fluid, mineral oil bleeding out. And but for the grace of God and the fact that they missed when they were surgically cutting these telecommunication systems, they missed one. They missed a link that allowed people in an off-site facility to see what was going on inside the substation. And as a result, when they saw the pressure dropping on those cooling radiators and the temperature spiking in their transformers, they did an emergency power down. Had they not known what was happening, had they not been able to do that, we would have lost for sure 17 of those transformers and probably the other 4 that weren't actually hit. The result of that, had it happened, we're told, would probably have been that San Jose and Silicon Valley and other parts of the San Francisco Bay Area would have been without power for perhaps 2 years, which is also a problem. Who were those masked men? Well, we don't know. They got away. The FBI doesn't even have a clue who they were. No DNA, no fingerprints on the shell casings, which were really basically the only thing left behind. My working assumption is they are at large in this country. They know how to take down substations, and that, again, is a problem. They're not alone, however, and I won't go through this at any length except to say that we have had others, including drug trafficking cartels and terrorist groups, take credit for having attacked grids elsewhere. Nobody took credit for this one in Nogales down by the border, but there would have been 30,000 people without power for a protracted period of time, and What we think of now as an increasingly porous border would have been even more so, needless to say. Oh, and by the way, back at the Metcalf substation outside of San Jose, it was attacked again about 2 weeks ago. Not with gunfire this time. People cut through the chain link fence, which is the protection it has, and stole stuff. Apparently, among things they stole were the security upgrades that were supposed to have been put in after the last attack. This is my sort of closing bit with you. Even if none of those things happens, even if we don't have a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, despite the fact that we know the Iranians and the North Koreans, and oh, by the way, the Russians and Chinese and probably others have been perfecting that capability for years in some cases. Even if nobody goes to Radio Shack or simply gets themselves an EMP test kit, they call them, which you can walk around with in a suitcase on the open market without any kind of restriction or regulation, which could be used for a radio frequency attack on the substations. Even if nobody uses cyber warfare against us, despite the fact that there's evidence that that's afoot, even if no one actually succeeds in this kind of physical sabotage, there is this problem. That is going to happen to us. This little orb down here is, of course, this Earth. That's not to scale in terms of its distance. It is to scale in terms of its size relative to the sun. And it gives you a sense of the magnitude of this coronal mass ejection, as they call it. These things happen with some regularity. Fortunately, because our little orb is pretty small, most of them go off elsewhere. But roughly every 150 years, we believe one comes here. The last time was 1859, when we had basically only telegraph wires and offices as the kind of electric infrastructure of today. They caught fire, and were giving us an indication of what would happen in a much more electrified society today. According to the National Academy of Sciences, if one of those things called a Carrington-class event, because Richard Carrington observed solar flaring and then saw the telegraph wires burning up and put the two together, the NAS says it would cost us between $1 to $2 trillion to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And it could take up to 4 to 10 years to do it. Do I have your attention? Congress took testimony earlier this year in which it was said with authority that the probability of this happening is 100%, it's just a question of when, and that the effects would be cataclysmic. Why so? Because, as I'm sure especially the electric engineers in the room know, when that goes down, it has a cascading effect on all of these other critical infrastructures and more, which basically is the difference between our functioning 21st century society and one that looks a lot like that blackout and mass migration that I showed you in 2003. Just one other data point that's particularly interesting. 2 years ago, last July, one of these giant Carrington-class events came to a point in space a week away from where the Earth would be in its orbit. That's what's called in astrophysics terms a close call. NASA marked the occasion of the second anniversary by putting out this press release with the helpful data that the probability of that Carrington-class event happening here in the next decade is 12%. Those are a little better odds than Russian roulette with a 6-cylinder revolver, but not much. And I don't know many of us would play that game with our lives, let alone with our country. And yet we are, because nothing is being done about this. You've been given, I think, a handout, a little booklet. This may sound so over the top that you can't believe it's true. This is a compilation of the executive summaries of 11 different studies that have been performed by or for the federal government in the past decade. It's called Guilty Knowledge, what the US government knows about the vulnerability of the electric grid, but refuses to fix. It's not a secret. It's not a secret to our government. It's not a secret to our enemies. Only the American people are being kept in the dark about this, and the problem is if we don't do something about it, they may be there permanently. I made that point. Let me just close with this. I had the privilege, as was mentioned, working in the Pentagon under President Reagan. Learned a lot about this then. It was a highly classified issue. The military went to great lengths to protect what it considered to be the most critical of its assets, namely its nuclear forces and its command and control systems. We know how to do it. Specifically, you use basically these three techniques. You probably have, I hope, a surge protector on your home computer or other electronic devices. Think somewhat bigger, but that's the basic idea. You have shunts or capacitors that move surges around what it is you're trying to protect, or you have Faraday cages which shield them from rays that may be coming not just through the wires, but elsewhere. This is prosaic technology, basically. It's known, it's in hand. We basically just need to apply it to the grid. The costs are relatively modest, particularly in contrast to the costs of, as I say, trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We're working on this. I'm here in the hopes that you will help us make the sorts of changes to the grid that will ensure that we all survive, whichever of these very, very ominous developments could eventuate in the very near future. With that, back to you, Mark. Thank you.
Okay. How many are depressed?
I ended with good news.
You did give us good news. I got to ask, I mean, I'm thinking, what's going through their minds? When President Reagan came out with Star Wars, he was ridiculed. Did he know all this?
I think that he probably knew the most important pieces of it, which is that in a nuclear war, there would be these kinds of effects. The trouble is, of course, that in a full-on nuclear exchange, you're probably not going to be worrying most about the condition of the electric grid as a result of EMP. You know, there will be horrific blasts and other damage done. But I think what President Reagan was very keen on, and I had my particular portfolio in the Pentagon for about 4 years was nuclear forces and arms control policy. And one of the things that he was determined to protect was our ability to conduct nuclear tests, because they were among the ways that we figured out what vulnerabilities things like our satellites or our nuclear forces, or for that matter, other systems had. Now, sadly, after he left, we stopped doing that. In 1992, we conducted the last nuclear test, and that's a whole nother issue as to how reliable the nuclear weapons we have actually are. Maybe we could talk about that. But I think our level of awareness about the nature of this threat diminished dramatically as a result of stopping those tests. And more to the point, the Pentagon never thought, and I think understandably, that protecting the civilian grid, which is 85% owned by the private sector, was its responsibility. Now, you could argue that it should be, because every facility in the United States, 99% of the defense facilities in this country depend on that civilian grid. So they have a stake in it too, but we all do. And we now need to get on with the business of making sure that the grid is at least as protected as those things the Pentagon has been working on all these years.
There was a report that came out in 2008, I read it today, by Dr. William Fortune. It's a primer on EMPs. Are you aware of the document, and do you think it's a good analysis?
Well, I'm aware of his work more generally. I'm not sure I've seen that, but I do commend to you something that he did as a work of fiction to try to make this even more accessible to more people. It's called 1 Second After. And it chronicles what happens in a little town in North Carolina after the power goes down and stays down. And it's not pretty, to say the least.
Okay. The United States government, its military, know this exists. Do the people we consider to be our enemies or potential enemies, North Korea, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, do they all have this technology? Could they launch a vessel that would put out this explosion?
Yeah, look, there are different ways of doing it. If you have intercontinental range ballistic missiles, as the Russians and the Chinese do, the North Koreans are getting shortly, you can use that. You don't need to fool with the boat. If you don't have the long-range missiles, the boat is an option. If you have short-range missiles, the Iranians do. They're getting shortly, I think, despite the negotiations that are supposed to keep this from happening, a nuclear weapon, the Iranians. So it's a matter of time till they have this capability as well. And as I say, they've been putting into place the other building blocks for it. But this is the piece that's so troubling. This is, again, not something that I'm speculating about. It is in the doctrine of Russia and China and North Korea and Iran to use electromagnetic pulse attacks. They usually treat them as just one of the kinds of cyber warfare options available to them. So tragically, again, the government of the United States is pretty clued up about it. The enemy is clued up about it. It's really just we, the people, who are mostly not aware that this is even a problem, let alone how deadly serious a problem it could be.
Americans have now gotten used to the term ISIS, but now in the last few days, Frank, they've learned about a new one, the Qurayshins, who are the evil twins. Some people say even worse, and they're from Syria. Is it possible that these rogue outfits could come up with a way to be able to somehow use this weapon against us, either here or on foreign soil?
Well, let me just make one point before we get into the specifics of your question. I personally believe it is delusional to think about the problem from these kinds of groups as being confined to one or the other of these groups. This is like treating symptomatically a metastasizing cancer. What we're up against is global jihad, it seems to me. And that jihad is now evident not just from the Islamic State, as they call themselves, or ISIS, as you say, or ISIL, as the president likes to say, or this new group that we've just bombed, or the Taliban, or Hamas, or Hezbollah, or Boko Haram, or Al-Shabaab, or Al-Nusra Front, or the Muslim Brotherhood. These are all part of a global enterprise, and they have our destruction as their explicit purpose. Make no mistake about it. They believe it is God's will that they will impose what they call Sharia. I mentioned that at the first slide, on all of us, and they will use violence to do that because Muhammad taught that's the most efficient way to do it. Unless you can't, in which case they'll do what the Muslim Brotherhood is specialized in, which is kind of subversion. But to your question, is there reason to believe that any of these guys would use this kind of technique, that is to say, taking advantage of our grid's vulnerability? And I think the answer to that has to be, unless they're brain dead. Of course they would. Because think about it, and I go back to that, I think it was the second or third slide I showed you. If a guy like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was thinking about a world without America, and I believe all of his friends, and whether they're Sunni or Shiites, all of his friends, his co-conspirators in the global jihad, are thinking about bringing about a world without America, there's simply no more efficient way to do it than this. And think about it. I mean, even if they're just confronting the United States military, which they would like to neutralize, if you could take out the power supply to basically the entire infrastructure of the Defense Department in the United States, that would be a body blow, needless to say, to our power projection and our ability to confront them where they live. So I think, and just as an example, Mark, one of my colleagues in our Secure the Grid coalition is a really remarkable former CIA analyst who went to work on the Hill on several of these commissions by the name of Dr. Peter Pry. And Peter did a just fairly straightforward connect the dot exercise recently. There were reports, as you may have heard, the administration has poo-pooed them, but they're true, I believe, that this Islamic State outfit now has operatives in our hemisphere. Some question as to whether they're inside our country yet or not, but certainly at the border. In fact, in Juarez, across from El Paso, across the Rio Grande. Peter said, well, one of those groups that I showed you a moment ago, the Knights Templar drug trafficking group, turned off the lights in the Mexican state of Michoacan for the purpose of demonstrating they could do it, and by some accounts actually killing people when the power was out. The point is that we know that these Islamist groups that are now in our hemisphere are collaborating with narco-traffickers. And so it's not too far a stretch to say at the very least they could be collaborating with people who would use, if not a nuclear weapon or exotic EMP radio frequency weapons, at least just old-fashioned sabotage to take down the grid. And by the way, if I haven't ruined your evening yet, let me just add this data point. After that attack took place in the Metcalf substation the first time in Northern California, a group that has sort of a more or less oversight responsibilities rather than real control of the grid, called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, asked for an analysis of how many of the critical substations across this country, like the one in San Jose, it would take, were they to be taken down through similar kinds of sabotage, for the grid to collapse. And as you may know from the Wall Street Journal, the answer was 9. 9 critical, not just any substations, they have to be the right ones, but it's frankly not all that hard to figure out which ones they are. And 9 is not a large number for a dedicated cohort of terrorists or jihadists to exploit.
If the power goes out because of this, in reading this, it would take years to get it back. And they say in the first year, many Americans would die for a whole variety of reasons. Those who are on life support, those who rely on pharmaceutical items, food would spoil. I mean, everything would be affected. Unless, I think in this report it indicates if you had a 1965 Volkswagen that's piston driven with no computers in it at all, you might be able to drive it, but then you wouldn't be able to get gas because the pumps wouldn't work. So we'd be back to bicycles and horses, probably. I mean, it's frightening to think about this. From what you've been able to determine and your organization, is there a plan to, over time, since we're not prepared to deal with it now if it happened, get us to the point where we would have protection? Or can that happen?
Well, it is hard to get your head around how ugly this could be. And I take no pleasure in sharing it with you, except I think you've got a need to know, if only because I think your help might be the difference between A, whether there is a plan, and B, whether it's executed. And what really got my attention, as I said, I've been worrying about pieces of this, for 30 years or so, really, since I was in the Pentagon. What got my attention, I have to say, was about a year ago last June. I attended a conference in Washington in which that solar thing was introduced. I didn't know about that. And that sort of moved this from gosh, this is a really worrying thing, and what if one of those bad guys did something to us, to this is going to happen, folks. And it's a question of whether, we actually have a lot of time to do this in a painstaking, elaborate way. I'm not sure we do. So, again, Mark, to your question, the people who know the most about the grid and who have the most, literally, on the line with the grid are, of course, the electric utilities that own them. As I said, 85% of the grid is owned by the private sector. About 15% is owned by us in places like the Bonneville Power Administration and the Tennessee Valley Authority. These guys will tell you, if you ask them, the utilities, that they've got this under control. There's really nothing to worry about. I don't believe that. And I've spent enough time now talking with them and listening to what they say is the reason they have it under control to tell you that I just don't believe it's true. So we really do need a plan. We have a piece of legislation that we're hoping is going to get through at least the House of Representatives before the end of this year called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. And its purpose is simply to see if we could get a plan that would at least get people thinking about how do you mitigate, the problem here. And it's going to be triage, let's face it. You'll start probably with those critical substations and try to make sure they're as resilient as you can make them, and then you'll start building out from there. But Mark, I have to tell you that I don't think that plan exists today. And if somebody said, as I'm praying they will, this actually has to be done right now. We need a Manhattan Project kind of effort to go get this under control, because I don't know about you, I live on a farm, but I wouldn't know how to grow anything, for God's sake. I don't have the tools to grow anything. And even if I did, it would be years before I'd grow anything that I could live off of. How about you? Where do you live? Do you need power? Do you grow food? Does it have to be supplied? I was with Judge Janine the other day, as a matter of fact. She is really seized with this issue. Yeah. And she said to a group of actually electric utilities guys, she said, I have to get my food at the grocery store. She said, actually, I don't even go to the grocery store. Somebody brings it to me from the grocery store. She said, and then somebody cooks it for me because I don't know how to cook. She said, I'm going to starve to death.
Yeah.
And that's the point. She's not alone. And, I don't know whether it's right. People have cavilled with me about it. But the guy who did the first of these studies, the chairman of it, Dr. William Graham, one of the preeminent nuclear physicists, in fact, one of the guys who first figured out what this EMP thing was all about back when that test took place in 1962. He says his estimate is 9 out of 10 of us don't make it after a year without power, simply because we aren't equipped, most of us, to cope.
I want to ask you a question. Talk among yourselves. Is there a bunker? I mean, we hear about this. Seriously, Frank, is there such a thing? I mean, some of the people who have said that there is a bunker, and everybody who's really important in this country knows where it is, because if we had this happen, they'd go straight to the bunker. But some of the people are former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura, who was written off as a nutcase. Frank, I've talked to you on radio for almost 20 years. Is there such a thing?
I formally worked, as I said, in this part of the business in government, and was involved in what was then called a continuity of government program. And there was a bunker or two out there, and they'd have to kill you if I told you where they were. But frankly, unfortunately, I think they've all been disclosed since that day, because the Cold War's over and we don't really need that sort of thing anymore. The Greenbrier Hotel was the place where they were going to take the Congress, as you may know. That's been compromised. But, the truth of the matter is, I don't know of any capacity in this country to provide sustained protection for anybody. You may get, and you put your finger on it, or Bill Fortune did, you may get to a place where you've got 3 months worth of food and 3 months worth of fuel to run your generators and so on, but after that, what? This is the rub. I think part of what we really ought to be talking about here, and this is kind of a mind-bending exercise for you too, we need a civil defense program again.
Yeah, what happened with that?
Well,
that went away when the Cold War ended.
You know what happened? No, it went away before the Cold War ended. You know what we did? And this, again, is another of these things you just can't believe it. Back in 1972, President Richard Nixon signed a treaty with his Soviet counterpart by the name of Leonid Brezhnev, the purpose of which was, we thought, to basically prevent either of our nations from having a comprehensive anti-missile defense. It was called the ABM, or Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And we faithfully adhered to it. We had a little bitty one for a little while, and then we got rid of it because what was the point? The Soviets, however, kept theirs going and maintained it. But more to the point, they didn't do what we did, which was to say, well, if we're not going to defend ourselves against missile attack, why would we defend ourselves against bombers or, for that matter, anything else? So we really chucked over the side by the mid-'70s civil defense. You know, you can still find occasionally one of those artifacts of a place where it says, you know, nuclear fallout protection or something here, but there's nothing there. Or very, very, very old cans of food, to say the least. And I think, you know, whether it's one of these kinds of disasters or maybe it's just, you know, the next horrible hurricane, we would be better served if we had, in fact, put that back into place and provided at least a modicum of protection for our people, not just our leaders.
Before we come to the audience with your questions, and we'll have Alyssa on one side, Kyle on the other, have microphones ready. I want to ask, this is a Homeland Security issue, CIA, FBI, every federal agency would be in play on this. We had
Or out of business, as the case
Or
may
out
be.
of business. We had Congressman Ron DeSantis sitting right where you're sitting now, Frank, and I said, what happens if we get an EMP? And he just went blank for a second because it's something so horrible, it's a doomsday scenario. Do we have anybody, pardon me for saying it this way, do we have anybody with us on the Hill? Or, 10%, 20% of elected members with us or not?
Well, again, this is where you guys come in, I think. We need people on the Hill to know that people they care about, particularly, for the next 6 weeks, are worried about this, are interested in it. I think it's still the case, quite frankly, and I don't know what Ron's blank look was, but might have been trying to figure out what
heavy.
EMP was. But most of the members of Congress that you would talk to wouldn't know. And most especially, they don't think it's a priority because they don't think you think it's a priority. So we need that change. There are a number who have actually been really serious about this and working hard on it for a long time. Preeminent among them is Trent Franks, Representative Trent Franks from Arizona. Michael McCall, who's now the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the House, has been pretty serious about it of late. Pete Sessions, who's the chairman of the Rules Committee in the House, which is a pretty key position, has gotten seized with it. A couple of Democrats, Henry Waxman and Ed Markey now in the Senate, and Yvette Clarke, Bronx, I believe it is, or Brooklyn congresswoman, have been interested in this too. But we're a long way from critical mass, if I can use that expression, with a nuclear issue like this. And, you know, there are those who think that we won't do anything about this until something bad happens. And I just have to say to you, my study of this tells me that by the time something bad happens, our ability to do much about it is going to be very, very much degraded, and a lot of people will be needlessly lost.
I used to think the Chinese were going to use this on us, but then I thought, gee, they own so much of us now, their investment would go down the drain. It doesn't work for them to do that, unless they just want to keep the infrastructure in place.
Yeah. You know, if you really get into some of these doomsday scenarios, removing the people but leaving everything else intact might not be a bad strategy if you want to populate another country because you've got way too many people of your own. I just have to tell you, I don't know what the Chinese actual intentions are. We know what their capabilities are. We know what their doctrine is. And I think it's always a good idea when you see capabilities and doctrine to figure that intentions are probably tracking pretty closely. And you know, you hear this a lot. There's no doubt about it. They've got a lot invested in us, in our debt and in our businesses. We've now just given $25 billion to their IT conglomerate, Alibaba, in investments here. But unfortunately, one of the things, and we spend a lot of time talking about this on our radio show, Secure Freedom Radio, which I commend to you, podcasts, if you're interested, Secure Freedom Radio, is that there is a dynamic at work in China right now that is destabilizing in the extreme. And these guys would not be the first authoritarian regime to use external threats, or war even, as a means of justifying domestic repression. So it may not make sense to us. Somebody said to me the other day, who's just done a book on the subject, back at the time of the First World War, people said Germany and Britain could never go to war. They were each other's most important trading partners. And yet they did, with ruinous effect.
Now we're going to come to the audience. If we can bring the lights just a little bit for the audience. If you have a question or want to ask something of Frank, Alyssa's going to come here, Kyle is going to come here, and we're going to go left to right and into the audience. And we ask you to be brief. You're first tonight with us, with Frank Gaffney here at Embry-Riddle.
Thank you. You may have gone over this already, but how long would it take to secure the grid if we started today, and would it in fact protect us from the solar flares that you talked about?
It depends. It depends on what kind of protection you do. I'm of the view, for reasons that have just been made, I hope, obvious, that we should take an all hazards approach. We shouldn't just say, oh, we'll improve the physical barriers at a place like Metcalf, but leave it vulnerable to power surges of one kind or another, or cyber attack. Again, I think if you were to take a triage approach, which simply says you deal with the most critical of these things on a most urgent basis, you probably would get the most critical of these pieces protected reasonably well. I would guess in 3 months, maybe 6 months at the outside, probably. I mean, this is not my area of specialization, so I'm sort of winging it on the basis of what I've learned. But I think some of this isn't actually, as I said, that hard. It's just a question of saying we're going to do it and applying the resources and will to doing it. To harden the whole thing, to harden all of the things that could go south, and I don't know whether it's just the 65 Chevys that don't, but that's a much bigger order of business. But in that regard, I would just say one thing that we ought to do. Anybody familiar with the smart grid? Well, you may not have it yet, but it's coming. The smart grid is basically an advance on the electric distribution system that allows them to monitor more closely how much is being consumed, and in some cases, if you're producing some, for
smart
example,
meters,
solar, to get the power back into the grid. Anyway, the point of this is, the smart grid will be stupider than the grid we've got if we don't protect it against these kinds of pulses and surges. You're just building vastly more failure points with the computers that are being put outside every business and home when you make it smarter. So doing sensible things to keep from making it worse is a place to start while we're fixing the rest of it.
Let's come up here now. Good evening. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for coming to our school. As someone who's obviously hoping to go into something like aviation and all that, I mean, electricity is our life. So what can not only the private sector, but as normal everyday people, what can we do ourselves to also improve this, besides obviously making Congress and Senate aware of this? What can we in our everyday lives do to protect against these events?
Well, again, I'm for preparedness. Don't get me wrong, and I'd like to see that done at the individual level and done at the community level. I think that's just sensible, no matter what the contingency you're worrying about is. We've got to get our heads, as I say, back to thinking that way, and I'm sure there will be resistance to it. There'll be costs and so on. Candidly, having said all that, for the reasons that we've been discussing, I think it's hard to get to a point where you'll actually be able to prepare yourself so you'll survive. Some will, some will. But as somebody pointed out when I mentioned that 9 out of 10 of us probably won't, a wag offered, you probably won't like the company you're keeping if you're in that 10%, because they're likely to be pretty ruthless folks. And one of the things that will keep them going is they will go find you and the preparedness that you've undertaken and live off it instead of you. So again, I think this is the kind of hard problem that has to be addressed at the macro level, not individually or micro. But individuals can play a role. Let me just give you one other example. We're talking about Washington. There's actually been a concerted effort made of late here in Tallahassee to get the level of awareness in your state legislature up. There's a woman whose name I confess I cannot get straight, Vasalinda, something like that, who has really taken the lead on this. She's a Democrat, and I'm not quite sure where she's from. She's gotten Governor Scott, I believe, favorably disposed to getting some work done on this, to think through kind of perhaps even emergency order needs to be issued by him. And that could set things in train right here in a state that, you could harden your grid, even if others aren't doing as much. And by the way, my conviction is if any governor in this country says, I'm going to protect my people and my businesses against these kinds of eventualities, there isn't going to be a governor in the country that isn't going to follow suit. So it may be that we don't have to wait for Washington to get around to it. It's taken forever. But at the state level, we've had some in Maine, in Virginia, in Arizona, in Colorado, here, where various state-level initiatives are taking place. You could really help reinforce that, if you will, as well.
Up in the back, good evening.
Yes, a good defense is a good offense. Now, if we're vulnerable, they're vulnerable. Now, don't you think that they may have given this some thought about a retaliatory strike by the United States, therefore keeping him in check?
I think they've all given it a lot of thought. And again, that's part of why I'm talking to you, is because we haven't. This is all the more ironic because, as you may know, particularly those of you who've served in the military are probably aware that when we started our campaigns, I believe against Slobodan Milosevic as well in Serbia, but certainly against Saddam Hussein twice, one of the things we did was take down his grid. Talk about glass houses. I mean, what on earth are we thinking? The Russians and Chinese, the question was about bunkers. There's no doubt they have gone to great lengths to build bunkers to protect their leadership, and I think probably to protect a lot of their critical, non-leadership populations, their industrial base, certainly the party cadre and so on. Will they survive something as horrific as that Carrington-class event? I don't know. But as Mao was fond of saying, he was okay with the nuclear war because he could easily spare 100 million people. It's a pretty frightening thought. So have others thought about it? Yes. Are they fearful of us retaliating using an EMP against them? I don't know. Are they probably pretty convinced that if they could do what I just showed you a moment ago, that scud in the tub thing with no fingerprints, that they could actually preemptively take us down to a point where we couldn't retaliate? I don't know. But, war is the history of the world, but the history of war particularly is fraught with examples where people simply miscalculate. And I don't want to give them any basis for making a misjudgment that they could go first in this fashion.
Is this the primary reason why we hear about preppers? And are you a prepper?
I don't think it is the primary reason. I think a lot of people who have been prepping have very much picked up on this as they've learned more about it, and it's become part of why this is growing like topsy. I'm afraid I'm not as thorough a prepper as I would like to be. As I say, I live on a farm. We've got some water, we've got some food stashed away, and so on. But for reasons I've mentioned, we're not heavily enough armed to protect it for very long, frankly. So it's the kind of thing I want to go home and do more of. But in the end, I want to fix the country, not just fix my own personal situation.
Let's go over here. Ray, good seeing you. Thanks.
Good seeing you. Thank you, Mr. Gaffney. Ray Sanchez, Volusia 912. And we do get together with a lot of groups and preppers and things. We've had a lot of forums in our talking to preppers. But I guess my question to you isn't the answer, because I always hate to look to Washington, D.C. for all the answers that come down. And so yeah, of course, the big objects that have to do with the war and those kind of things, but isn't it better to just make sure that we let the free enterprise do its job to decentralize power and control when it comes to energy so that we can rely on ourselves more than having to look to a central government to fix all our problems?
Yeah. It's a great question. You know, I'm often given to say I'm here from Washington and I'm here to help. You know that line. Don't count on it, first of all. But second of all, I think you're absolutely right. This is one of the pieces of good news, going back to this gentleman's question. I think the possibilities for microgrids that could provide a much more resilient source of power for communities or for industries or for, you know, populations is one of the promising developments. We need to do more of it. One problem is that unless, again, you've protected those microgrids, they're not going to be any more resilient than anything else. Solar, for example, you might have interest in here. You're putting a lot of it in place, but it's generally not resilient against these kinds of pulses. So that's not a panacea, but it can be part of a solution. And I couldn't agree with you more on the broader point, which is take responsibility at the local level even. I mean, some of you probably have a local power authority that you could have a lot of influence with. I've tried talking to people at Florida Power and Light, and it's been a dialogue of the deaf.
Really?
Yeah.
Do they deny the existence of this?
Well, as I said, what you typically get from the utilities is sort of three arguments. One is, we know all about this, and we've got it under control. Principally, they'll say, if there's one of these intense power surges, particularly the solar kind, they'll just power down their, transformers so that there will be enough margin that they won't burn up. Well, that's okay unless they've miscalculated on the amount of power that this surge will put through if the sun really does one of these things. And by the way, I've learned so much about this in the course of sort of dropping everything and trying to focus on it. I went out to Boulder, Colorado, where we have the National Space Weather Center. And the guy who runs it is an eminent scientist and been enormously helpful in clarifying a lot of this, by the name of Bill Murtaugh. Bill said to me the other day when I was out there, by the way, he showed me, those, you see them in the sci-fi movies and war games and so on, the big NORAD panels with the various threat scenarios and so on. Well, he showed me one that had a time-lapse photography of that storm that I mentioned that happened just about 2 years ago. And in the first, you got this huge, golden orb of the sun, and on the side were these two ugly black spots. And then he showed me the time lapse of, I think it was a couple of hours later, and those things were moving inexorably towards the middle of the sun. And the problem with that, of course, is when they're in the middle, they're pointing at you. And he said there was a really high pucker factor because for a while it looked as though it was going to be a dead-on thing. It, again, was a couple of days away. But to the point, I think that the degree to which we know this is coming, we are on notice that it will be very bad, that the guys like Bill Murtaugh are telling us that we're on borrowed time, in a sense, right now, that we've got people in the utilities who have no reason not to know that they won't be able to survive by simply powering down. And by the way, when they power down, that's a problem for you too, right? Now, if they're able to bring it back up, it's not so much a problem, but if they can't, then you're toast. The thing that I really want to say is when they tell you that they've got plans, or they tell you that they've been doing exercises, or they tell you that they've been meeting at the CEO level monthly to talk about all these things, just ask them this question. What have you actually done to harden anything? And the answer almost always is nothing, if they'll tell you the truth.
When I think of the federal government as the answer to this, I said, yeah, this is the same group of people who during the anthrax and ricin scare told us to use duct tape, don't have a lot of faith. Let's go back to the audience over here. Your question now for Frank Gaffney.
Hi, thank you. Not long ago, you were talking about how it is being thought of the implementation of the smart grid. But then you also said that the effects on the smart grid would be even worse than at the moment if we're not capable of protecting the grid. So what would be the purpose of even considering implementing the smart grid if we can't protect the grid? If we can't run, and if we can't walk, why run?
Well, it's a good question. I realized that I forgot to mention what Bill Murtaugh shared with me that was particularly interesting besides that time-lapse thing. He said, we don't actually know the worst that space can throw at us. The Carrington event is about the worst we know of because we had some way of measuring it at the time. And we have historical evidence going back in tree rings and that sort of thing that says it can be very bad. But he said, we don't really know. And to your question, I think, if you were approaching this in a responsible fashion, you absolutely, positively would not put in place a smart grid until, at the minimum, you have made the one we've got more resilient. And then, and only then, if you have figured out how to make those additional control devices and computers and so on resilient as well. I mean, this is really irresponsible. And as I say, I know some of the pressures that the utilities are under. They're being told they have to get rid of their nuclear plants, or they're just not going to build anymore because it's so horrifically expensive and time-consuming. And they're being told they have to get rid of their coal-fired plants. And they're being told they need to put in a lot of solar and wind-powered plants. And then they're being told they need the smart grid. And all of this in a regulatory arrangement that's restricted. I get all that. I honestly believe, however, that they have to be part of the solution here. They've got, as you all understand, a lot on the line, as do the rest of us. If they're leading, I think we can get this done much more efficiently and effectively than if they're not. But if they're not going to lead, and if they're going to continue to pretend this isn't a problem, or they're going to give us mumbo-jumbo about planning sessions and exercises and meetings, then get the hell out of the way, because this cannot be sustained any longer, I believe.
Before we go back to the audience, your organization, and you mentioned this movement to save the grid, what are you looking for the public to do? Are you looking for financial support, letter writing? What do you want the public to do?
Yes.
Okay.
All of the above. Look, financial support, we're doing this on a shoestring, so I'm not here flacking for that, though if you like, we do have a tax-deductible organization, Center for Security Policy. I am looking for your help in any other way, and let me just give you a couple of examples. We've talked about, getting in touch with your representatives in Washington. We've talked about getting in touch with, people here in your state government. Some other ideas. Anybody here invest? Oh, come on, you do so. Do you invest in utilities? Do you invest in mutual funds that invest in utilities? Probably.
Absolutely.
So you're a shareholder. You have a need to know, frankly, whether there's material risk that is not being disclosed properly. That actually is a problem for these guys, I think. And I'm not leading with that because I'd just as soon have them figure out this is in their interest to do without getting ugly about it, but that's a problem. In fact, Judge Janine at this conference in San Francisco made that point. She said, I'm a former prosecutor, I'm a former district attorney, I'm a former judge, and you have material risk that is not being disclosed, and that is a problem. So that's another place in which I think people could be helpful. But the main thing is get knowledgeable about this. Talk to your family about it. Talk to your business associates about it. Talk to your local media about it. Talk to the people who write editorials in your local papers. Talk to, Florida Power and Light or whoever is providing your power here. This is the sort of thing that I believe is approaching a tipping point. I think that the real decision is, are we going to do this before something bad happens? And that will be determined by whether enough of us get clued up about it and engaged enough about it to insist that it does, in fact, get done, at least on a triage basis and right quick.
Way in the back now, your question.
I'm curious on the scale of the tragedy. When the solar flare does hit the Earth, will it impact the entire Earth or only the sunward side?
Very good question, and I'm the last person to tell you much about astrophysics, but it's my understanding that when one of those big things comes off, the length of time during which there will be this highly electrified matter coming our way is going to be longer than it takes for the Earth to, make a full rotation. So it will expose, all of the planet. And interestingly enough, that event back in 2012, 2 years ago, that I was telling you I saw on the big screen, was actually a 1-2 punch. And this is apparently not that uncommon. In fact, we had one just the other day. It's just that it didn't come directly at us. It was kind of oblique. But when the 1-2 punch hits, apparently that first one will just set everything. The magnetosphere, they call it, is going to be reversed and, otherwise afflicted. And then that second one comes in, and it's like a puncher. When your guard is down, it's even worse. So that's of concern, and it would apparently be a problem worldwide. I'm told the Russians and Chinese have gone to great lengths to harden their grid, at least for, as I said, sort of critical users. Most of the rest of the world doesn't have much in the way of a grid. And those that do, I think, are all basically unprotected.
Back up here in the back.
Good evening, Mr. Gaffney. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for visiting our school tonight. My name is Gian West. I'm with the Homeland Security program here. I feel like this question is probably a little bit already been answered. People have addressed the private aspect of it and what people should do with the government, but as a realist, I feel like I have to kind of ask this question. So it's no secret that the U.S. critical infrastructure isn't as secure or even maintenance as often as it should be. Our roads and bridges are crumbling beneath us, unguarded or laxly guarded power stations, and so on and so forth. So my question is this. Given our government's history of typically approaching and handling issues such as these in a reactionary manner instead of a proactive one, how would you propose that we go about making this a priority on the U.S. national agenda? As in, how do we bring this into the limelight and keep it there? Short of a major attack, how do we get the average American to shift their focus from primetime reality television and onto an issue such as this? I found that in recent issues that I've tried to convey to people that I've grown up with and family members and such. I mean, it typically just falls on deaf ears. They oh yeah, that's interesting, and then they kind of just brush it off, and it goes away again.
That is the big thing that we talk about in media all the time. How do we move them from keeping up with the Kardashians to keeping up with this new group that's like ISIS? They're going to have to see something.
It's a terrific question, and I guess I'm here because I'm not sure what that answer is. I think the answer is probably, in part, a function of how folks like you respond to what you've heard. And I'm doing this a lot around the country, and a lot of other people, Judge Jadine notably, are doing her bit. But we need help. Candidly, we need help. I will just give you a couple of things that I think may be moving our way in a fashion. I mentioned, I believe, that there were reports recently that this Islamic State operation is threatening the homeland as we speak. That they are in Juarez. I've been told by colleagues that there are people kicking down doors in Juarez, Mexico right now looking for them. There's that much chatter. Now, whether that's right or whether it's in Juarez or whether it's someplace else, I don't know. But what I've found in my travels and in my interactions with folks like yourselves is that if people take this aboard, if they're open-minded enough to actually hear it, as opposed to just trying to figure out why it can't possibly be so and then get on with their lives, if they actually hear it, most people think this is something that actually has to be addressed, that needs action. And they become part of the solution, in my experience. Now, another thing that I think we've got going for us is that because this horror, if God forbid it were to happen, would fall on all of us, certainly to varying degrees. I'm fond of saying, without regard for political philosophy or party affiliation. This is actually the ultimate transpartisan issue. And it's something that, as I said, and I think answered your question, Mark, you know, we have seen people on both sides of the aisle back in hopelessly, you know, riven Washington come together to try to pull together to fix. But they need a lot of encouragement and help. And I've just been in this sort of political environment, not as a politician, but working on the margins of it for a long time. And I just can tell you for sure, what gets addressed is the squeaking wheel. If they think this is a politically salient issue, it will get attention. And especially if we can find ways to make it something that's happening, even without them, at the state level or even local level, then I think we'll have movement. But I would guess I just answer in the briefest of ways. Tell me what you think you can do to solve this problem. Because everybody in this room can do something. And maybe it's just a phone call to your elected representatives. Maybe it's dropping whatever else you're doing and doing this. Maybe it's, you know, doing your thesis and your Homeland Security studies on this particular problem. I can tell you the Homeland Security Department needs a lot of help on getting their hands around this thing. So we're all in this together. We have a chance, I don't know how long it is, to do something about it before it becomes exceedingly hard, if impossible, to fix. So I just throw the question back to you, really, in a way. Ask not what I can tell you to do, but what can you figure out to do yourself?
Let's go to the audience. Alyssa with Jerry Kenny.
Hi.
Jerry?
How you doing? Hi, Frank. This may come as a shock to you, but I feel that we are as over-reliant on technology in this country, and it seems to me as though the grid is half of the equation. We have integrated circuits in just about everything from toasters to aircraft. Once the grid comes back online, if there's nothing if we can't find anything to plug into the grid that will actually work, it seems we need to address that side of it. Is there anyone addressing the fact that we have products from computers to airplanes that won't run once the grid comes back online?
I'm so glad you said this. It sounds sort of Luddite to be denouncing technology. I've just been driving around in Dallas the past couple of days watching people standing outside of the Apple store for the Apple 6. So, I mean, around the block. So I don't think this is going away anytime soon, at least as popular demand as any guide. Well, I kind of tried to allude to this in response to an earlier question. If you do triage on this and you focus on trying to get the power grid to survive or to be reconstituted, you are going to have a lot of other things in the food chain that are going to be a problem. Some of them are easier to solve than others. If you have a chip that might be fried, get yourself another chip and put it in a Faraday bag or wrap it in tin foil or put it in your microwave oven. Just don't turn it on. Because your microwave oven actually is a Faraday cage. It's meant to keep things from coming at you, but it also keeps things from going in. Look, again, one of my insights into this whole story is the grid is an extraordinary accomplishment when you think about it. It grew like Topsy over 100 years or so from a couple of electrified communities to this thing that operates all over this land. And amazingly well. I mean, we do have blackouts and we have storms that take things down and so on, but it's amazing that it works at all, frankly. It's a Rube Goldberg operation when you think about it. It evolved, and at no point in its evolution, as best I can tell, did anybody say, we actually have to protect this thing against somebody blowing it up. We have to make it resilient. It's all been basically, we just have to see if we can't keep it going and bring it back if it breaks at any point. We're in a different time, in a different world. And I'd like to think that if this message is really taken aboard for the grid, there will be people who are starting to think about how do we make these other pieces resilient. And by the way, if I may, just one further digression. You get a lot of interest in talk at the moment, particularly in Washington, but probably here too, about cyber warfare. I mentioned it as one of the threats. But I keep saying to people, listen, let's just say for the purposes of discussion, and I'm not a cyber kind of guy, needless to say, but let's just say you could come up with some perfect, absolutely, insuperably perfect defense of whatever, your computer, your cell phone, your control device for your grid. So that no amount of engineering and adaptation and, cunning hackers could ever overcome your protection. Well, if the damn things don't have power, those computers aren't going to be much use. I think of them as sort of glorified paperweights. So your point is very well taken, sir, and I think it's something that flows, I hope, from the question that I'm trying to focus on, just because I don't think if you don't fix this, that matters much. But it matters a lot, especially if you're getting serious about fixing this.
We got time for one more question from the audience, and then Frank will also have copies of the book to as many people as we can give them to at the conclusion. Right over here, Kyle with the microphone, go ahead.
You said you had, good evening. You said there are three ways to protect against
I've lost you.
an attack,
She's right here.
and that would be a Faraday cage.
If you could stand, ma'am, so the...
There you are. I see you. No, I'm sorry. I just couldn't figure out who was speaking. Go ahead.
You said there were three ways to protect a Faraday cage, which we can't really put the whole state of Florida in it. And you said a diverter, and you said a surge protector. So which of those could we economically and quickly do? And in your opinion, what is the thing that we should aim for doing? Thank you.
Well, again, I am not going to be drawn into a discussion of how you do serious engineering on the electric grid at an academic institution where they teach people this stuff. I'm not equipped to do that. I've got a lot of friends who would be delighted to drill down on this with you if you'd like. I would simply say to you, from my limited understanding, you probably need to be thinking about using each of those techniques in various applications, because some of them will save against a particular phenomenon or threat. Again, the good news is, and I really want to leave you with this, I tried to earlier and Mark dragged me right back to the bad news, and there's plenty of it, but the good news is I worry about a lot of very bad things. I spent my entire professional life worrying about national security problems ranging from, nuclear attacks on this country to the Islamic State. Most of them are exceedingly hard to do something about. This isn't. This isn't. Yes, it will take some time, it will take some resources, it will take some effort, some national will. But at least it is a soluble problem, I think. So I would just say to you, if you are interested in this, please contact us. It's the Secure the Grid Coalition, securethegrid.org. And I will be happy to put you in touch with people who are really skilled, people who, for example, have spent 40 years protecting some of those assets in the Pentagon, who can give you chapter and verse on how to do it, where, what, and so on. And that's the kind of effort that we need and the kind of teaming that we need, because when I think people like you, who may own shares of Florida Power and Light, or at least their customers, are on their case and are providing them with specific, concrete, practical solutions, you might just be able to get them to do something, and their counterparts in this state and elsewhere.
Certainly
Thank you.
one of the most important and interesting guests we've ever had here at Embry-Riddle. I want to very quickly thank Mike and Mike up in control who ran things tonight, John Wara back at WNDB for producing tonight's event, Bob Score, who's videoed every one of these for the last several years and has done a magnificent job, and you'll be able to see them at the Embry-Riddle website. To Alyssa and Kyle, thank you for working with the audience tonight and for all your great questions. I want to tell you about what's coming up. Frank was Nostradamus earlier when he mentioned cybersecurity. That's next. We have two professors here, Professors Gary Kessler and Ramsey Seeker, who will be with us on October 8th, talking about cybersecurity. Ever since Target and Home Depot, everyone is wondering, I can't wait to get my statement to see if it was used somewhere else. And we've actually had people call us and tell us that they've already been getting reports from their credit card companies that this has happened. We'll talk about cybersecurity, what your privacy is. That's on the 8th. The 28th, John LeBoutier from Fox News Channel makes a return to Embry-Riddle to talk about the midterm elections. And you'll have a chance to ask him questions about any of the elections days before the decision. November 5th, the day after the election, we'll talk with the author of a book who, this guy was actually from the St. Louis Dispatch, and he wrote about ministering to the Nazis at the Nuremberg trial, who did this and why they did it. And then on the 19th, we conclude the fall series with a flower shop in Baghdad. We'll talk with a colonel who will tell us, actually a major, how Iraqis built their new Air Force. And this was written before we started going through the mess we're in now. That's all coming up, and right here at Embry-Riddle. Ladies and gentlemen, you are a marvelous audience. We thank you for being here, and listen for a subsequent broadcast on WNDB and on the website. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, our featured guest tonight, Frank Gaffney. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. We hope you have a very pleasant good evening.